thanks, Duncan, and very pleased to be here. And what I wanted to do is take a slightly different approach to what we normally sort of talk about in text and data mining, which is kind of looking at scientific, technical type literature. Before I do that, just want to explain who we are, so you know why, if for any reason I'm qualified to talk on this subject. So I work for a company called Linguamatics. We're based in Cambridge. We were founded by 4 University of Cambridge computational linguistics people, and we also have offices in Boston. And basically, we're a software house. We build a text mining software platform, and we're pretty much, well, we are the market leader in life sciences and healthcare. And as well as pharma and biotech and healthcare institutions like hospitals and cancer institutes. There are some government organizations which include the FDA who use our software as well. So we're quite well established, and we've been working in this area for quite a long time. NLP, for those who don't know, is natural language processing, not neuro-linguistic programming. And I believe if you saw the previous speaker, Kunsan, he talked about natural language processing quite a lot. So these are the areas we typically work in. We kind of like, scientific, technical areas, and people are using it to do things like R&D, and they're trying to do sort of analysis of clinical trials, do some competitive intelligence and stuff like that. But actually, what I wanted to talk to you about is in a completely different area to all of this, because we wanted to look at Twitter as a data source rather than scientific articles. So before I start, I just want to give a quick, very, very quick 101 of text mining. And I know that the previous speaker mentioned it, but I just want to try to bring everyone up to speed as to what it is. So essentially, you start off with data of some kind, right? And the difference between using standard keyword search and text mining is that the text mining software tries to essentially read the data and try and interpret what it's saying, and then extract information from there. So, in the same way, if you think of it cognitively, what we're doing when we pick up a book or when we pick up a newspaper article, we start reading things, and we recognize words in there that refer to a thing. A thing might be a person, it might be some kind of, organization or whatever else. And then we're talking about things that, how that is interacting with something else. And we work all that out, and it's all natural to us, we're humans. For a computer, we basically have to train it to do that. We have to tell it to say, okay, well, when you read this, this is how you should interpret it. And so in the end, what people want to pull out are facts, relationships, and assertions. So we want to pick out relevant pieces of information that answer the question, provide the answers to a question that they're putting forward. So here's just one example of, there's lots of different ways that you could explain NLP. This is what our 101 NLP, if we only had to show one slide when we look at our software, what do we do? So what happens in NLP? If we look at the text at the bottom here, right, where we find that P42 MAPK phosphorylates CMIB on serine and 309. I won't read the rest, but that's the text I'm looking at. So the first thing it will do is it will analyze that text and see that it's comprised of 2 sentences. And you might say, so what? Okay, that's great. Now, just the fact that we understand there are sentences can be quite useful, because basically, if 2 or more words co-occur within a sentence, it's likely that they're going to be more relevant than they do if that one word occurs in a title and the second word occurs on page 23 of the document. So the 2 might not be related, but the fact that we've broken it down into a sentence, then we could say, okay, well, if you type in a couple of words and they occur within a sentence, there's a good likelihood that they are related in some way. The second thing that we can look at is, are there any things within there? Now, in NLP and text mining areas, we call them entities, but if we were just talking as humans, we'd say, well, is this a thing? And by a thing, I mean that P42 MAPK is a thing, CMIB, serine, and threonine are a thing. But also, a combination of words like purified recombinant P42 MAPK is a group of words that's describing one thing. Okay, so it's important not to just say, okay, well, using a simple dictionary approach, I can just say these are matches, but I can also say that groups of things actually refer to one thing. And it's important to be able to recognize that, because we would, as humans, if I was a scientist reading it, I would recognize that as one thing. Secondly, we look at actions, verbs within there. Okay, so we find that find phosphorylates, but also a group of words was found to phosphorylate as actually referring to, an action. And then finally, we look at sort of like, things like find and found are actually the same word, but from a different tense, so they are the same thing. That is effectively, at the very base of what we do. That's what we're trying to do, but we do it on a very, very large scale on millions and millions of documents, right? Okay. So very quickly, if you, just to summarize, in terms of keyword search and text mining, by the way, I'm in no way, basically I use keyword search and I think keyword search is useful. I'm just trying to use it as a way to describe the difference between the two approaches. If I take a question like, what genes affect breast cancer? That's quite an open question. I look across lots of different data sources, right? If I take a keyword approach, I'm basically saying, I want to match a number of words within a document, and then you'll produce a list of links, which when you click on that link, it will take you to a document that contains those words. And by the way, to express genes affect breast cancer is actually quite difficult in itself in a query, but I won't go into that. The point I'm trying to make here is that actually the list that you get back are lists to documents, and you have to read all those documents. So if you get 1,000 hits back, you have to read 1,000 documents. Now, there are ways you can use to filter those things down, but effectively, that's the approach. If you take, in text mining, what you're doing is you're basically saying, okay, I'm actually going to extract pieces of information. So if we look at the bottom right, I don't have a pointer here, but if you look at the bottom right here, right, these are actually assertions being brought back where it says, look, this is a gene known to affect breast cancer. I'm bringing back a fragment of information that corresponds to the question, what genes affect breast cancer? So lots and lots of talking about scientific. Let's move on from scientific to Twitter, right? Because this is what Duncan asked me to talk about, is to take a slightly different approach and say, okay, what have you done with Twitter? Because Twitter, first of all, it's an interesting sort of like data source. The big thing to know about it as a characteristic is it's a noisy feed. By a noisy feed, we mean there's lots of irrelevant data, right? And it's effectively, it's a bit like sort of like putting your ear into a room full of millions and millions of people and trying to hear what the conversation is, right? And it's quite a difficult thing to do because it's just a general hum and you don't know, you might hear the odd word and effectively that's what's happening. Now, about 5 years ago, we started doing Twitter analysis and we've been doing lots of Twitter analysis since then. And we've done it on all these different subjects. Obama healthcare reform, London Rail and Tube Network, things to do with strikes, antidepressant drugs, the earthquake in Haiti a number of years ago, swine flu vaccine, UK television debates, and the Copenhagen summit as well, just to have a look and see what people are saying about those different areas. The two I'm going to focus in on, because I could talk for hours on this, right, is these two, swine flu vaccine and the UK election debates. So let's start off, first of all, with the flu vaccine case study. So put your hands up if you remember the flu vaccine, the flu sort of epidemic that happened a few years ago. You remember that? It was very high profile in the news. And then essentially what happened was that we kind of like were told we should be taking these vaccines to help immunize us. And so we decided to do a study, not just to see sort of like saying who's saying what, but more specifically, who's actually getting the vaccine, right? And who is saying they're not getting the vaccine. So not just people sort of like scaremongering or general rumor or discussing the subject in general, but quite specifically saying, I am getting the vaccine, I am definitely not getting the vaccine. And then what's influencing them? So that's an interesting thing. And if I look here, basically, these are the type of things that we would get out of Twitter. And Twitter uses abbreviations, it uses sort of like, all kinds of slang, colloquialisms. But it's interestingly, it's quite well structured as well, and you can take account of that when you do the NLP. So you can say, I have the flu, I have H1N1, got a dice. But basically, all these things are all sort of like essentially saying the same thing, which is, I have got swine flu. And I noticed a few people laughing because of the way that people express some of these things. And that's just the way, that's an idea of the type of feed that we are analyzing. These are actual tweets from there. And then what we can do using our software is to try and cluster those together and say, okay, well, if all these are not exactly the same words, but they're expressing the same thing, which is, I'm going to get the flu shot, then I can cluster them together. And so that's what's happening here, where we're saying that actually, if anyone is saying who's just got the flu shot, I got, or getting it, I just had, all these are actually people who have actually had the flu shot or are definitely intending to get it. And there's lots and lots of different ways of doing it, and we can basically cluster all of those together and say, yes, we count those as one thing. So, it's an interesting thing. You can't just look for flu, and you can't just say get, and because also you need to take in negatives as well, saying I am not getting the flu shot, for instance, or I will never get it, or things like that. So the other thing that we want to do is find out, well, how did these people come to their conclusion on not getting it? Were they influenced in some way? So obviously not all of them, it's tangible to find out how they were influenced, but other ways that these people were actually sort of like influenced. And we then also had a look at sort of like segmenting the population, making a distinction between those who are already sort of like who've already had the flu shot, who are about to get the flu shot, or using competitors' products, etc., and as well. So here's sort of like a summary of the analysis, and it's a lot more detail than this, but like here's a little sort of like snapshot of like the influence network with regards to who took the flu vaccine, and you can see immediately that there are two clusters. There's a cluster to your left, right? And those are the people who are getting the vaccine, and a cluster to your right, and they're the people who are not getting the vaccine, okay? And so that's quite interesting in itself, understanding that there is sort of like a clustering together of those types of users. But then when we have a look at within there to sort of like, see what was influencing them, in particular, an interesting example that I'm going to pull out is for the people who weren't getting it, there was a certain site that was having quite an influential sort of like, effect, and that's Natural News. And obviously, as the name suggests, that is not going to recommend you using sort of like, chemicals and so on. So therefore, that seemed to be an influential site for the non-getters. For the people who were in between, basically some were being influenced by and against. There was something that was evident there, which was that flu.gov, which was the government site, was seen as a sort of like impartial site influencing them. So that was interesting there. And then in the wider network, so there wasn't much clustering. So the wider network signifies people who are generally talking about swine flu in different ways. They're not talking about getting the flu shot. And so we couldn't pick up anything within there to sort of say, oh, there's some influence going on, because that was just general murmur. So that's the flu vaccine. I want to move on to election case study. I'm just going to check I've got time to do that. How am I doing for time, Duncan? Okay. Right, so you recognize these characters, don't you? So we've got, let's go back there. We've got Nick Clegg, David Cameron, and Gordon Brown. So we're going back 5 years. I know we had an election earlier on this year. This is back in 2010. And the reason this proved to us to be an interesting thing is that this was the first time in UK history, right? In American history, it's sort of like been going on for a while, but the debates between the leaders were actually televised. So this time round, it was all well accepted. but last time around it was the first time. And so what we monitored was sentiment towards, it seems to be on autoplay at the moment, but anyway, what we monitored was the 3 debates that went on ITV, Sky, and BBC One, 130,000 users and about 500,000 tweets. And then during the broadcast of the debates, we actually monitored all the tweets. So it was during that 2-hour period while the debates were going on. So that's what we were monitoring. And we were looking for basically looking at positive sentiment. And we deliberately chose positive sentiment because actually the negative sentiment was irrelevant because there was lots of people just coming up with profanities or coming up with I don't like so-and-so and whatever, or this person's XXX. And they're all irrelevant. What we wanted to capture was someone saying, you know, I really like that. I like the point that they were making. That person came across really well. Because after looking at all the tweets, it seemed that like that was much better way of gauging whether someone was going to sort of like, you know, vote for that person rather than saying, I'm definitely not going to vote for that person. Which they weren't explicitly saying, but, you know, just by. And to be perfectly honest, the majority of the tweets that came out were actually negative. So there was just a lot of noise, just people taking the mickey out of the candidates that were there. So these are the type of things that we counted as positive. Great point from Nick on funding. We think Clegg is winning. Nick Clegg seems to be doing well in the debate. I think Gordon Brown won the immigration round. Brown is winning. So these are all the different things we counted as positive. These are the things that we filtered out. So this is an example of the stuff that's coming through. So he, a bit like Charlie Brown. So Charlie Brown's got nothing to do with Gordon Brown. Don't like the way Clegg talks to the camera all the time. So you can't really gauge much from that. Look a bit like Gordon Brown in a few years. Well, that's got nothing to do with. I don't like Nick Clegg's black shoes in a navy suit. So you know, these are things that. So you get an idea of how noisy this feed is, right? You know, and you're trying to sort of like say, okay, well, I don't want any of this stuff, and I want to be able to pull it. Take it out. And using NLP, natural language processing, and all the other tools that we've got in the box, we can actually sort of filter a lot of that stuff out. So here's an interesting one. So during the debates, I was actually sort of like, you know, recording the time all the questions were coming up. So we had questions on European Union, Afghanistan. You can read them all up there. I won't read them all out. But, and I noted the times of all of those. And because each tweet has, is stamped, is time-stamped, we could then look at, you know, how that correlated to the people's opinions when those questions were being asked. Because remember, we were monitoring this in real time. So it's quite interesting, you know, you can see the yellow spikes there. So Nick Clegg came across well on European Union, also came across well on pensions. You know, scandals and trust. Actually, Gordon Brown did well on that one there. Funnily enough, David Cameron didn't have any spikes at all there. But that was quite interesting just to see, you know, people's sort of like, you know, opinion. And if you cast your mind back, you know, for the UK people, Nick Clegg, for the non-UK people, I should say, Nick Clegg was brand new to the electorate. Really, he was people knew of him. But he was quite new and fresh-faced. He came on, and suddenly people sort of like had a real empathy with him, and kind of, you know, and he got a spike in positive opinion when during the first debate, and that sort of shows that there. And that's just another way of looking at the same data. You know, just instead of spikes, we kind of like do it as bar charts, and you can see immigration, for instance. Nick Clegg, clear leader there. Crime. Gordon Brown, clear leader there. But, you know, Clegg doing pretty well on all of those. Health, David Cameron did pretty well there on that one. And this is the interesting thing, and this is kind of borne out in the actual election results, is that you see in the first debate, you know, we had 57% massive, huge positive sentiment towards Nick Clegg, and that gradually went went down as we progressed across 2 or 3 weeks in the debate. And Gordon Brown in red kind of like fluctuated very in a minor way. David Cameron actually grew in popularity. You can see he started off with 18%, then ended up with 31%. So that was interesting because that actually sort of like then ended up in a fairly good reflection of the actual results, which were that, you know, when we looked at our results, so our results are here, so first, second, and third, and we did a very simple, I mean, this is, you know, really noddy in terms of, we just did a simple linear extrapolation just to see what percentage of the total number of votes, out of the total number of votes that would have been cast, would we come up to? We came up with 37%. When we looked at the election results, it was 36%. So that was pretty good. And then when we looked at Clegg, his showed a sort of like decline. And when we extrapolated out from the third, we got 25%, and the actual election results was 23%. So that's a sort of like a really great result, and so we published it, you know, and as a result of that, it got picked up by you know, some prominent agencies, you know, New York Times and BBC News, and so we got sort of like, you know, a lot of inquiries coming in saying, how did you do this? And I actually got called into a Hansard Society to go and talk about this because they were saying, well, is this an accurate way of doing it? And my conclusion is that it isn't an accurate way of doing it. And that's because, you know, first of all, the demographic of Twitter doesn't really match the demographic of the voting people who cast votes. And secondly, you know, this is just a sample across, you know, a number of debates. But it certainly is an interesting way to sample that information. So with that, I'm going to actually stop there and open up for questions.
Thanks very much, Guy. Do we have any questions for Guy? Do we have a microphone going around? Does anyone have any questions? Front here.
I was wondering on the timeline, the x-axis, that was actual number of tweets, and that seemed like a very small number of positive tweets out of 100 or out of 467,000. You know, it says 20, 30, 40, 50. What's that?
I haven't got that in front of me now, but I don't believe that would have been the actual number of tweets. And if what we would be looking at is the number of tweets that were positive for at that particular time. So it would be over a space of, so if you imagine the question being asked and people responding is a few minutes, so the number of tweets would be over a few minutes. So we had in total 567,000 tweets over 3 debates. So that would be sort of like 180,000 per, you know, if it was uniform per debate, and then that's within a 2-hour period. So then you'd have to do, yeah.
Hi, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask how the results were for this year's election.
Well, you can put me on the spot, but that's an easy one to answer. I've no idea, because we didn't do it this year, and it wasn't at the time it was novel, and no one had done it, and we were working on a particular Twitter project with another academic institution, Imperial College, and it seemed like that was a good subject to do at the time. So it's just like a serendipity of things coming together at the right time. This time round, we were just busy with work, so we didn't have time.
What a shame.
Yeah.
There's one more just there.
I was very interested in what you said at the very end about the Twitter demographic. Because it seems to me that you may have done it much earlier than others, but it's quite fashionable now to do analysis of Twitter because the data is relatively easy to get and process. And you know, Twitter tends to be used by urban or suburban people. It tends to be used by younger people. It tends to be used by high-income earners. You know, there are all sorts of worrying things going on if people are using this to profile a population. And it seems to be that you were very good in making that qualification, but it seems to be that qualification is often lost. And there's a kind of a real exclusion thing going on here, that Twitter is almost being taken as a sort of sounding, as a barometer of what a nation is thinking, and something like that. I mean, how would you respond to that? Because it's important that kind of thing gets over to policymakers, and there isn't this simplistic understanding about Twitter being this barometer, except of a particular sort of profile.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point, and that's why I did stress at the end. I didn't think it was, you know, an accurate way of doing things. I think the best way to view that type of analysis is more like vox pops. You know, the way where, you know, a journalist would just go out into the street and do a sample. You know, what do you think on this? You know, what are your views on this? You know, we asked a number of people, and this is what they came up with. I think coming up with a statistical analysis and saying whatever, you know, although interesting though the results turned out, you know, I don't think it's sort of like, you know, completely reliable to sort of like say, you know, okay, we'll do that again and it'll work again. We'd have to do it a number of times. The other thing is to bear in mind is, although there are people excluded in Twitter, you know, in terms of like some of the ones you mentioned out, what's interesting is that I didn't realize until I looked at the profiles that actually there's quite a lot of older people, you know, 45 plus, who are using Twitter much more. I always viewed it as a younger person's, and so that kind of like fits into the voting demographic more easily. So there's some characteristics which do suit Twitter, but so others don't.
Great. One last question over there.
Hi there. Great talk, by the way. I was really interested by the technology you guys have built, and obviously you've built it over many years. I can definitely see use cases within our company to use that. If we wanted to get started with it, is there certain, for example, open source projects or things that you might recommend we start looking at if we wanted to use kind of similar technology to what you've built?
Yeah, there are a number of open source NLP platforms. There's a few barriers that you have to get across, right? The gentleman at the back there said it's easy to get hold of the data. Actually, it's easy to get hold of some data. It's not as easy to get hold of all the Twitter stream. You have to basically go through and buy access or get access from Twitter to basically sort of like what's called as the hose, the sort of fire hydrant of Twitter feed. You can get some streams, but like to get everything is quite difficult. And then you'd have to use open source technology to kind of go and analyze that. I think it's quite a big job to do it, if I was perfectly honest.
And just to follow up on that, so the data we'd be interested in using it on is actually our own data. So we definitely have access to that. But is there any particular projects you'd recommend we start looking at if we wanted to start using it, or just Googling for it?
Well, no. I mean, obviously, there's our company that does commercial text mining software, and there's a number of open source sort of like text mining platforms. I'm trying to think of some off the top of my Gate is one. You know, there's a number of them that are out there. If you maybe if we can talk afterwards and give me your details, I can send you some information on some of the open source ones.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Guy.